Okay, this is the house, Grosvenor's Lodge, a very, very nice house. You can see electric gates, really secure, nice high walls, I thought at the time. I moved here immediately from Douglas Lawn. It's it was, I thought, a very safe house. I lived here for 6 months and my son went to school here and I continued working in the CUH children's ward for 6 months. I gave up work at night. I had always worked in restaurants here in Ecos and the Bohemian. I had always worked at night for extra money and to save to get, out of here, or holidays for me and my son. We liked to travel. But this house, okay, 6 months I lived here, never went out at night, kept the curtains closed, felt safe, worked away in the hospital, became friends with one of the patients' mother. Amanda was the patient and Mandy was the mother. And Joe McSorley, he owns McSorley Transport. He lives up here in Douglas, in Shamaclawn, just there. And Jimmy Higgins is a taxi driver. And they came to my house for dinner when we were having dinner in the kitchen and, laughing, doing what normal 25-year-olds do. And the front door wasn't this front door here, these weather glazed doors. It was white. I have pictures. Literally just came off the hinges. They didn't open it. They just pulled it up and off the hinges. And two men were standing there, John Paul Walsh and one man wearing a balaclava. They came in and immediately grabbed Jimmy and danced on him. There was so much blood. It was just, I thought he was dead. There was literally a fountain of blood coming up out of his mouth. It was unreal, straight up out of his mouth. I'll never forget it. I can still see it right now. I can see the fountain of blood. And Joe McSorley pulled out my fridge and he hid behind that fridge. They grabbed me and put me into the boot of the car. Didn't say anything. They just put me into the boot of the car here. Okay. So no, this was a very safe house, I thought, So, sorry, you go through, you relive, you never forget a detail. You never forget anything from their faces, what happened, what was said. So they put me into the boot of the car and then drove out here to Douglas and stopped outside the Douglas Garda station. That's how cocky they were, and took me out of the boot of the car and put me on the floor of the back seat. And the man wearing the balaclava was driving the car and John Paul Walsh was in the back seat, and he was screaming and shouting at me. You made statements, you told the guards everything, you made statements to the guards, you're going to die now, what do you want to do for the last 5 minutes? And he just kept screaming that over and over for like 4 minutes. It felt longer, but it was only 4 minutes, because by the time we got to the top of the hill, he said, what do you want to do with it for the last 5 minutes of your life? And I looked up at his face, and I looked up at the man driving the car. And when I saw the balaclava, and I knew I was going to be killed then. So I looked up at him, sweet as I could, and I said, he had hold of my hair. I said, could you let me sit on the chair? Could you just let me sit on the seat? And he let go of my hair. I think it took him, he didn't expect me to say something like that, and as sweetly as that. And I looked into his eyes, and he looked back at me, and he was just kind of taken, his eyes were glazed. I'll never forget it. They were so scary. So he let go of my hair, and I went to sit up on the seat of the car, and I put my bum up slowly, and I kept staring at his eyes and put my hand slowly behind my back, and in my head I was like, pull the door handle and fling yourself out if this is you're dead otherwise. So I was lucky. The door opened and I just threw myself backwards straight out the door. I rolled down the hill, and it was a bright sunny day like this, and another car stopped, and immediately they took me to the Garda station in Douglas, which was only 3 seconds away. I was screaming, Jimmy's dead, there's so much blood. I'll never forget, my whole body was shaking. It was unbelievable. They came over here immediately, and forensics, Gardaí with white paper suits and white shoes, even though I in my head I see blue paper shoes on them, but everyone has said to me since that it's white paper shoes, but I still see blue paper shoes on them. They took everything away in evidence bags. I didn't see them dust for fingerprints, and I was watching everything because I thought Jimmy was on the floor dead, but he was alive. Mandy had run out the front door, and Joe McSorley had hid behind the fridge. So they took everything away, sealed off the house here with the tape and everything, so everybody knew, something traumatic had happened. It looked like a murder here, and that was it. That was like literally. Oh, a guard came in. At the very end, a guard came in. I'll never forget his face, with a moustache. I'll never forget his face. And he picked up my cross and chain off the sitting room floor, and he put it between my breasts. Now, I was sitting down crying. Everything, I was bleeding from every area of my face, my head. And he put the cross and chain between my breasts, and he said to me, "Forget about it. Just forget about it." And I said, "How do they know where I lived? How do they know I made statements? How do they know? How do they know?" And I kept saying it over and over and over again. And he just said, "Forget about it." And I looked up at his face, and I said, I knew in my head then I was on my own. There was no help. So the next morning, there was a man fixing here. I think everyone just came down to have a look at what had happened in the village, in Douglas Village. And this house, Connor Downey, convicted murderer and serial rapist, was living. And they were fixing this house, O'Callaghan Builders. Connor Downey was working in Beeline Cabs for years, running the phones in Beeline Cabs, a serial rapist and convicted murderer. So they were all friends. John Paul Walsh, Mr. Long, I now believe, was driving the car wearing the balaclava. He was arrested for kidnapping a lady out in Ballyphehane 50 years prior, and raping her and dumping her out of the boot of his car, murdered her, and he was arrested in Lockdown 2 for murdering that lady 50 years prior, 49 years prior actually, they said. Connor Downey, he died in this house last year. He was either set fire to or he burnt himself to death. Mysteriously, he was murdered as well, or died. John Paul Walsh was in prison for life. I'll get to that part of the story later. He died in his prison cell just after I rang the prison to find out was he in prison in Lockdown 1, because I got death threats in the post. And it'll all come together now when I'll explain everything. He died in his cell in Lockdown 2, I believe. Mysteriously, but just after I had rang the prison, and they had rang me back to say that he had no phones and he had no way of accessing me, or because I had helped put him into prison and he was serving life for kidnapping and murdering another young boy, a disabled young man, John McManus, who had just received $1 million compensation. And John Paul Walsh was out on bail for trafficking children, drugs and guns, and he was out on bail, and he kidnapped him and tortured him for 4 days in his flat. From this story in the papers, there was blood prints everywhere, handprints. They tortured him like me. But unfortunately, as he tried to escape out a window, they stabbed him 56 times in his back and got caught dumping his body out the country in West Cork. So I helped his mother and father in court. I gave all the recordings, everything to the Gardaí, and we helped to put John Paul Walsh, one of the kidnappers, in prison for life. Then Then 5 men came to my door a week after I helped, and he went to jail for life, to serve life. 2 men came to my door to take my son. He was 14 years old, and they went to grab him. And after I fought, and after what seemed an hour, but it was probably 5 to 10 minutes, they took me out the country. And oh my God, what they didn't do. There's 3 other men waiting out there, and what they didn't do to me for hours and hours and hours and hours, and dropped me right back to my front door maybe about 10 hours later in a pool of blood, and told me if I ever went to the guards again with anything, they'd be back for my son. that was I stopped going out immediately. That was maybe about, it feels like 20 years ago, but it was less, maybe 17. I have all the dates, everything. From this house, from the minute I knew I was on my own, I started recording and investigating every single thing about them. I couldn't believe that nobody was ever arrested. I mean, John McManus would be alive today if they had arrested him here or out in Douglas Lawn. This house wouldn't have happened. Now, this man that was working on the house, O'Callaghan Builders, he asked me what had happened, and I explained to him, and I said I have to move immediately, I don't feel safe here anymore. And he said my son has contacts, and the next night he came down and he said to me, I have an apartment up in Sundayswell. So I moved that day up to 126 Sundayswell, Dan O'Keefe's house, Hegarty's Builders, and the apartment had bars in the window and it was underground, so it was underneath Dan's driveway. If you get me, I'll show you, I'll go up and show you. So I lived there and started working for Dan. I'll explain everything then. So I was working in the building trade then for 5 years, working with men. It felt safer. Now I was still very shook. I used to wake up at night screaming. My son, thankfully, he remembers me being drowned in the bath. He remembers everything. But okay. So my postman then lived up here, Mr. O'Mahony. He was arrested in lockdown 1, 2020 for stealing vouchers and letters from banks and solicitors' offices. I thought nothing of it then until everything was stolen on me. So on the 6th postman then was arrested. He cried in court there about 13 weeks ago, Mr. Hogan, that he had a drink and drug problem. That's why he was stealing all the mail. But he laughed in my face and he told me I'd never prove it, but he was on camera saying that. And I said to him, you're on camera saying this. And I went straight away over to Toker Post Office and reported him. And he was, as I say, he was in court about, oh God, it was maybe more than 13 weeks ago now. Mr. Hogan, Passage West, Ballinlough was his addresses. And then the 8th postman was murdered last month, maybe a month and a half ago now, in Mallow, Cork. I better pause now because there's people here.